the first thing we have to determine is where our light source is coming from. So we're going to put it up here in the left-hand corner, which means all of our reflections or whitest highlights are going to be on that side of our objects. Our cast shadows are going to go the other directions. We're going to be working with some drawing pencils today, so you'll want to go ahead and get those out now. So I'm going to be working with my pencils, which happen to be a 2B, and then I have a 6B, so those are my darker ones, B for being bold or black. And then I also have an HB, which is right there in the middle between H and B. And I happen to have a 4H. I think most of you are going to have a 2H. So you'll probably in your packet have like a 4B, a 2B, an HB, and a 2H. But anything within that range that you can pull out or have waiting for you is helpful. If for some reason you don't have drawing pencils, I always like a nice HB Ticonderoga pencil. They tend to work well. I can push a little bit harder and get a darker color, or lighter to get my lighter colors. I don't have to rely so much on my drawing pencils for that. But I like to start with my lighter pencils when I'm going in here so I don't overshade what I'm working. I'm going to leave that highlight area, and I'm going to start working my way out. I'm going to do some scumbling, which is laying my pencil on the side. I can use the widest part of my pencil while I'm doing this, and I can go in small circles, and I can work my way out to help get a nice, smooth, even gradation on these. And I'm overlapping as I do this. You don't have to go in an arc, but I tend to do that just because it helps me to keep focused on the overall form of that sphere that I'm working on. Now, I can push really hard on this pencil, like I am right now, and that's all the darker it's going to get. Because again, we're on that 4H pencil, or if you have 2H, it might be a little bit darker. But the point is, it's a really hard graphite. That's how I remember it, H for hard graphite. And it doesn't like to come off of the pencil, so it doesn't allow you to get really dark. We're going to keep our white spot in there. If it ever gets too heavy and you're starting to lose some of your white, you can push really hard with your eraser and then lighter as you work your way out into a circle, and that'll give you a nice gradation going from white off into those other colors. Now I can't leave it like this because it's not dark enough. So if I wanted to, I could go in and start layering a little darker. I could go with my next pencil down. Mine happens to be an HB. And I could go in and I could add more pencil in and more shading. So if you have trouble controlling the pressure of your pencil, your fine motor skills aren't real built up yet, this would be the way to go through with a different level of pencils and get it a little bit darker each time and not have to worry about pushing too hard. If I skip over to my 2B, it's getting softer now, right? It's going to be B for bold or black. Because by the time you get up there to that 6 or 8B range, it's pretty dark. If I go over my line a little bit, that's all right. I can go back with my eraser and erase things out. But I want to push pretty heavy. Again, it's not going to color any darker than that B limit that's on there. And then I also have my 6B, which I can go in and add along this back line for an even darker shade. And it's harder to stay inside the lines when you get that tiny for the scumbling and still pushing hard. So I'll go back and erase some of those out when I went outside my lines. Easy enough to do with a pencil eraser. I think some of you also have a little chunk of white eraser in your art kits. Now, the other thing you'll want to remember is we talked about that reflective light. So this light is shining down onto this sphere, which means it can't go through the sphere. So there has to be a similar shape out here. Since our sphere is round, we're going to do an ellipse over here that comes off of the actual form itself. And it's going to be dark and then go lighter, but not too light, still a shadow, right? Has a hard edge around it as it moves away from the object. And remember to leave that little gap. We talked about that reflective light down here. If you forgot to leave it in or it's not big enough, very gently with your pencil eraser right on the edge or the tip of your square one, you can go back in and erase that little white highlight or reflective light that's going to be in there. If you're not happy with things and you want to darken it up, you can always go back in and push a little harder and a little bit more firmly to really get the lines in there. Remember having those bright whites and those dark darks when we were looking at Kath Riley's work is what makes them look more realistic and makes things really pop as being three-dimensional. Now we're going to move over to our cube. Remember that our light is coming this direction, so our darkest one is going to be the face on this side of our object. So I'm going to flip my pencil sideways. Again, I'm going to do this one as a demo with my Ticonderoga pencil because I really like these for drawing. If you have only a regular pencil that you would be using, that you might have at home, and you can pick these up at any of your big box stores or grocery stores for the most part. And again, I'm laying it on the side. And the reason I'm keeping my finger here, you can hear it hit it once in a while, is so I don't go really far outside that line while I'm pushing hard. It's a lot more difficult to erase a pencil that you've pushed down really hard with than it is one that's very light. So I'm trying to keep it inside that line, and I'm stopping it at that line by using my finger. The wood of the pencil is hitting it and stopping. If you do happen to go outside, again, flip it over, use your eraser, it's okay. It's why they give you erasers on there. So that's going to be my darkest side. If my light's coming from this direction, most of it's going to be shining up here as my lightest, brightest part. This side is going to have a little bit more shadow to it, especially since it's next to the sphere. It's going to be casting a little bit of its own shadow somewhat that direction and not letting all of the light through. So on this one, I'm going to flip it on the side and gently color it in, sort of a medium gray color. About like that. A little darker, like I said, towards the bottom. I'm sort of doing oval shapes while I'm going back and coloring this in, and a little darker up the side, just because it's getting a little further away from the light source. Go back and erase my edges where it went outside a little bit. And of course, we're going to have a cast shadow on that one, and it's going to be a bit more boxy. Our sun's coming this direction, so it's going to head out more like that. And you'll want to have a nice, solid, dark edge to define your shadow edge from the dark side of your box, or the dark face of your box. And that's going to come out a little bit like that. And it can fade off as it moves out and away from your cube. Kind of like that. Some people will also go back and add just a touch of fade to the top of the cube as well, to give it a little bit of a tooth or a little bit of presence on there. As you're working, your fingers might get dirty with the graphite, so you might have to go back through as you move your paper around and erase those fingerprints. That happens in the artist world. That's just how it is. The next thing that we're going to go ahead and take a look at is our pyramid over here. So again, if our light's shining this direction, that's going to be one of our lighter faces over here, similar to how it was on our cube. So I'm going to give it a medium color, a little darker along the bottoms and this edge over here. And of course, this face is going to be really dark since it's not receiving the sunlight. I'll work my way across, trying to stay inside my lines. And you'll notice I rotate my paper a lot. You can rotate your paper so that you can reach other places without getting your hands dirty, or to get in all of those little nooks and crannies without going outside the lines. If you're rotating though, be careful that your lines you're coloring in don't go all different directions. You want to make sure you go back in and smooth those out. That's why sometimes it's helpful to go in and do that little oval or circular technique on top, that scumbling look to it, to smooth things out. Back up, check your edges. You do want to keep those nice and sharp. And of course, a cast shadow is going to come off of our pyramid as well, in that pyramid type shape, out and away from it. And make sure you have that real sharp edge under there to define the difference between the shadow and the pyramid. Sometimes you'll even get a little bit of reflective light off the back edge of a pyramid, depending on what's behind it. If it gets too light, you can always go back in with your finger, or if you want to smooth things out a little bit, use your fingers for some blending. Always a fun little trick you can do. But again, it's going to get your finger pretty dirty, so if you want to get rid of that before you get fingerprints all over your paper, mine's starting to, you can just turn it over on the back and rub your finger. If it gets elsewhere on your paper, take your eraser, go back in, brush it off on the edges like this. Okay. We also have a cylinder on here, and as we're moving further away, we're redirecting our sun, right, or our light source that's sort of going out this direction, so we have to keep that in mind. So the top part of this one is going to have almost nothing on it. I always like to put just a little bit of an edge on the top of my cylinder, almost like as if it was a Coke can. It has that little lip there, just to give it some definition and presence to let people know it's there. Now, when we work with cylinders, I'm going to tip my paper for this one. We're keeping this side lighter. The darkest core shadow on the cylinder is going to be right about here. They have a lot more reflective light on the back half of them. So I'm going to leave that space back there a lot lighter, more of a medium, or a 2B if you're looking at your color pencils, whereas this is going to be a 4 or a 6. And then you work it back over to that 2B, and then eventually to an H and a 2H, right, as you're getting lighter. Careful to blend. And this is too hard of a line for my liking. I want this to fade a little more gradually, so I'm going to go back and add in a little bit more graphite. Eventually it should be white. If it's shining over here, that's going to be the brightest area. Clean up my edge on the top there. And of course, I have to put in my cast shadow. So coming off of here, your cast shadow is going to be more of a rectangular shape. Nice and dark right against it object. And then it's going to get a little bit lighter after that initial darkness. So if you're working up on the point of your pencil, there's a lot more back and forth work as opposed to the side of your pencil. You'll notice I'm much more on the point. You have to have a lot more fine motor skill control to do this. Some of you may be at that point if you do a lot of fine motor type activities, or you have a lot of practice in art. Again, you can blend that out a little bit if you want to. Same here. And then I always like to do a little bit of light right across there just to emphasize that edge. Any stuff that's out and about that doesn't need to be, you can erase that out of your way. The last one we're looking at is a cone, which is a combination of your pyramid and your cylinder together. So thinking about that, your lightest part is going to be here, your core shadow. It's going to have more of a triangle look to it, the darkest part on the back here. So I like to start dark and work my way lighter. Some people like to start light and work their way darker. It's a preference and your ability to control how dark and how light you're able to shade with your different media. You can always go back and erase some too if it's not quite as light as you would like. So for example, this has got a little too dark up here for me, so I'm going to go back in, take a little bit out. Make sure I'm keeping my white edge on there while I'm working. And I need to define my edge a little bit more. I sort of got lost, and I can do a lot of that when I go in and add the shadow. So with that cast shadow edge, right, I find the edge of my cone and tilt my paper to make it easier to color on the side. There's no rule saying you can't tilt your paper while you're coloring and shading. A lot of people like to try and keep it straight up and down. Not necessary. Making sure we get that cast shadow in there. And I'm not happy, I know there's reflective light back here, but I want to make sure that we understand there is an edge there. It's difficult to see. So I think I'm going to make this a little darker back here, even though we have our reflective light bouncing off of it.